On May 3rd, 1886, with a dry west wind running 20 miles an hour across the bluffs and the noon temperature holding at 58 degrees, Earl Jennings rode into Sage Hollow beside Cottonwood Draw and stopped long enough at the hitch rail to watch a roofline tremble under a gust that was not yet a storm. The settlement held 312 souls by the church ledger, and nearly all of them lived under pine boards, shipped by rail on credit. Built high and quick in a season of optimism, painted in bright trims that looked prosperous against the grassland and thin against the sky. Wagons stood wheel to wheel in the main street. Men spoke of lot values and freight arrivals, and the steady tapping of new hammers gave the place a confidence that belonged more to a poster than to the high plains. Earl saw in one look what the town prized and what it had not yet learned to fear. He was 37 years old and a widower by one winter, with a face made hard by sun and a left hand marked by old rope burns that had turned pale with time. His belongings were plain enough to inventory in less than a minute. One scarred trunk bound in iron, 2 mules, a buckboard with one warped rear wheel, a roll of tools wrapped in canvas, a cast iron kettle, and a folded paper packet of receipts and family notes. The trunk had belonged to Ruth Jennings, and although no one in Sage Hollow knew the name, the hinges were bright from use and the lock had been repaired twice, first by her own father in Tennessee Hill Country, and then by Earl after she was gone. He carried no frame portrait and offered no public account of grief. He carried methods. Those methods came down a line of women who had buried men and rebuilt houses without waiting for permission. Ruth's mother, Eliza May Carter, had taught Ruth to prepare roof beds where rain came sideways and wind took shingles as if they were cards from a gaming table. Eliza May had learned the same work from her own mother, who kept a notebook wrapped in oilcloth with measurements for clay, sand, chopped fiber, and lime under different seasons of humidity. Earl had married into that chain and served it as an apprentice, not in ceremony, but in labor. He had hauled water, mixed mud, cut willow rods, tamped lifts, and watched the elders mark drainage by eye until he could read a slope from 20 paces. When Ruth fell ill and did not recover in February of 1885, the techniques did not soften his loss. They gave him one instruction that did not argue with sorrow: build for weather that does not negotiate. Sage Hollow sold him what it did not value. On May 5th, at the land desk in the back of Dunleavy Mercantile, Earl paid $18 in cash for a low parcel on the edge of Cottonwood Draw, ground that spring runoff crossed in wet years and mosquitoes favored in June. Better lots near Main Street sold for $65 to $140, depending on frontage and distance to the rail spur, and Harlan Pike had already secured the best corners for clients who wanted decorative fronts and second-story windows. Earl took the low ground because his survey rod found blue-gray river clay less than 4 feet below the topsoil, in a seam broad enough to cut by hand through summer. He marked a rectangle 32 feet by 24 for the main house, set a cellar chamber 16 by 14 on the north side, and staked wall lines thick enough to consume more material than many townsmen used in 2 homes. His plan drew no admiration. It drew attention. Harlan Pike noticed first and made certain others noticed with him. Pike was 42, broad through the shoulders from years in the trade, dressed in dark broadcloth even on workdays, with a gold watch chain that flashed whenever he pointed toward one of his own projects. He had built 41 structures in 9 years across western Nebraska, including Sage Hollow's schoolhouse, church frame, and the 3 largest homes on Cotton Street. And his word carried weight with labor crews and buyers who borrowed against future harvests. Where Earl measured with stakes and a string line, Pike arrived with flourishes, trim catalogs, and assurances that respectable families preferred height and ornament. The contrast was clear enough that men who had not met Earl by name began calling him the fellow by the draw. Work began before sunrise each day because clay behaved better under a cool shovel and because wind stole moisture faster after noon. Earl cut the first test trench by hand, 3 feet wide and 5 feet deep, and confirmed what he expected. A dense bed with enough plasticity to knead without slumping, mottled blue and gray, clean of stone larger than a thumb joint. He hired 2 laborers for 6 days at $1.75 per day each to help peel topsoil and shape the cellar pit, then released them when he shifted into foundation and mixing work that demanded patience more than speed. He laid a rubble footing 18 inches deep with local fieldstone set in lime slurry, raised earthen walls 20 inches thick in measured lifts, and left narrow vent channels high on the east face so warm air could travel without stripping interior heat. Every 8 feet he pinned a willow lattice tie through the wall body to bind courses against shear. Each choice came from precedent, not novelty. In late June, the warning arrived exactly as warning does on the plains, too sudden to impress the careless, plain enough to mark the attentive. On June 26th, after a noon heat of 89 degrees and a stillness that kept smoke low over the draw, dry lightning struck west of town, and by evening gusts tore shingles from the schoolhouse roof and twisted 2 unfinished frame houses off their blocks before the rain even settled. No one died. By morning, repairs were already underway, and the talk in front of the Mercantile reduced the damage to misfortune and haste. Earl read another meaning in the same debris. Pine seams had opened under driven rain. Roof pitches had no ballast. Nail patterns had failed where uplift concentrated at corners. He doubled his schedule the next day. From July through the first week of November, he planned for 5 months of hauling and sealing, and in the first phase he concentrated on moving raw material before frost stiffened the draw. His buckboard carried roughly 1,400 pounds per trip when loaded to the side rails. Clay laid over burlap to prevent premature drying, and he made 3 trips on good days, 2 when roads softened. At that rate, he moved close to 8,400 pounds in a week of 6 workdays, stopping only on Sundays for tool maintenance, inventory, and mending harness leather. He mixed at a ratio of 5 parts screened clay, 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part chopped prairie grass, and lime adjusted by humidity. Generally 1 part lime to 8 parts clay mass in July, and a shade more in August. Water came from 2 barrels set under canvas and measured by bucket marks, so each batch matched the last. He spread the seal coat 3 inches thick over willow lattice and packed sod, then burnished the surface with a hardwood float until rain would bead and run rather than soak and split. When materials ran short, he paid $42 for extra lime at rail price, cash again, and said nothing about cost. The mockery began as street talk and hardened into ritual. One afternoon near the well, Pike leaned on a hitch post and announced to a small ring of buyers that Earl was not building a house, but a burial chamber, then gave it a name that traveled faster than any invoice in Sage Hollow. Jennings' grave, he called it with a smile broad enough that children repeated the phrase before supper. Within a week, the words appeared in passing comments at the feed line, then in louder declarations whenever Earl's wagon crossed Main Street with clay to the brim. Pike told prospective clients that no respectable family would choose to live under mud and sod like cellar stock, and some men laughed with the relief of agreement. Earl did not answer in public. Once, as he tightened traces on his mules before dawn and heard the nickname again from the road, he touched the near mule's shoulder and said, "Let them talk. Words do not keep out the weather." By August, his palms had split at the base of both thumbs, and one shoulder pulled under a slipping load. Yet the work proceeded in measured lifts because haste ruined the very purpose of the roof. He set drainage channels at a 1-inch drop per 6 feet, cut clean to carry standing water away from seams where freeze could pry layers apart, and tested each run with a poured bucket and a marked stick. He kept ledgers by lamplight in Ruth's old trunk, recording weight hauled, batches mixed, cure days, and costs down to the nail keg, because memory under fatigue could not be trusted with a structure meant to stand through weather that erased careless arithmetic. When dusk settled over Cottonwood Draw and the town lamps came up one by one against the widening dark, Earl remained on the roofline, kneeling in clay, finishing an edge course that no passerby considered beautiful and no coming storm would find unprepared. He climbed down only when the last edge course held a thumbprint without taking water, and by then the light had gone from amber to iron, and the evening temperature had dropped to 49 degrees along Cottonwood Draw. He washed clay from his hands in 2 buckets he had warmed by the stove, checked the mule hocks for swelling, and then opened Ruth's trunk on the table to enter the day's figures in a hand that remained steady even when the shoulder ached. 56 bucket loads screened, 9 batches mixed, 27 linear feet of drainage lip finished. He paused over the final line, then added one notation in the margin as Eliza May had taught Ruth to do whenever weather looked ordinary but behaved out of season. Watch the night wind, not the sunset. Near midnight, wind came in short, hard pulses from the northwest, striking the unfinished corners of townhomes with a hollow clap that carried farther than hammer blows in daylight. Earl did not leave his bed. He listened for what the roof gave back. A plank roof answered in rattles and complaint. His clay cap answered in weight and muffled pressure, a low, continuous tone like distant wagon traffic under earth. In Tennessee, that sound had once made him uneasy, because he had grown up beneath lighter timber and shingles. Ruth had corrected him in their 2nd year of marriage, when a spring gale tore half a neighbor's roof and left theirs intact. "If it sounds heavy," she had said, "it is working." On this Nebraska night, the same principle settled over him like a blanket. The roof did not chatter. The roof held. By the 2nd week of August, Pike had moved from mockery to punishment. 3 laborers who had spent evenings helping Earl lift sod to the roofline were told in broad daylight that their names would be struck from Pike's contract slate if they appeared at the draw again, and 2 of them stopped coming before dawn the next morning. The 3rd, a narrow-shouldered Swede named Linus Dahl, stayed 1 additional week and then withdrew when his wife fell ill and he could not risk winter wages. No one shouted at Earl. No notice was posted. The message worked precisely because it did not need force. In a town of 312 souls, paid days in autumn determined whether families entered January with flour or with debt. Earl adjusted without petitioning anyone. He cut the daily hauling schedule by 1 trip, shifted that hour into roof tamping while moisture still sat in the mix, and rigged a lever frame from cottonwood poles so one man could raise filled hods to the parapet in controlled lifts. The torn shoulder, a strain along the rear seam that burned when he lifted above chest height, became a problem of mechanics rather than complaint. He split loads into 60-pound baskets, carried them by sequence, and preserved the damaged arm for finishing passes where pressure had to stay even. His hands opened again at the same old cracks along thumb and forefinger. He wrapped them in linen at night, then unwrapped them before first light because clay ruined cloth once it dried. On August 19th, with noon heat at 91 degrees and locusts loud in the drawgrass, he completed the main roof body at a final measured thickness of 3 1/8 inches over willow and sod. He did not celebrate. He began the cure protocol. Curing in that tradition was not waiting but management. For 7 days he dampened the surface by a measured sprinkle at sunrise only, never after noon, so shrinkage could proceed slow enough to avoid spider cracking through the lime matrix. He covered the windward half with canvas during the hottest hours, removed it by late afternoon, and walked every seam with a brass probe cut from an old harness fitting. If the probe entered more than a 1/4 inch at any point, He opened the seam and reset the section with fresh mortar. At the eave, he shaped a drip nose with a hardwood trowel, so runoff would clear the wall by 4 inches. That small lip, Ruth's mother had insisted, often decided whether a wall remained a wall after repeated storms or dissolved into repairs. Earl recorded each correction, each gallon used, each hour spent. He trusted records because grief had taught him that memory could blur under strain. Word of his methods reached the harvest tally gathering in the church frame before he did. The room smelled of wet wool, chalk dust, and lamp oil, with 27 heads counted by the deacon at opening prayer, and 5 more by the time ledger numbers began. Pike stood near the front in a coat that had not seen field mud and asked to speak after freight totals were read. He praised Sage Hollow's growth, warned against panic talk, and then turned toward Earl in the 3rd row with the polished confidence of a man used to agreement. "A town cannot rise," Pike said, "if every newcomer buries himself in mud and tells honest families to follow him underground. Jennings' grave is one man's grief turned into spectacle. It is not building." The words were met first by silence, then by scattered assent, then by the soft table knocks men used instead of applause. A motion followed, drafted in 2 lines by the council clerk. No Doug-style dwelling to be erected within the surveyed street grid until standards could be reviewed. Earl's parcel sat outside the strictest boundary, but passage would have marked his work as a civic wrong and invited wider prohibitions in spring. Debate lasted 19 minutes by the clerk's pocket watch. One councilman cited fire danger from low chimneys. Another spoke of property values near Main Street. Then Clara Finch, the schoolteacher, asked from the side aisle whether any member had inspected Earl's drainage or wall thickness before calling the structure unsafe. None had. The vote failed by 1 hand. The room dispersed into knots of private talk, and Pike left by the west door without looking back. Consequently, the formal ban did not pass, but the social ledger hardened. Earl was dropped from freight pooling for autumn coal, requiring him to buy retail by the sack at a surcharge of 12 cents per hundredweight. 2 suppliers declined him credit despite cash history, citing policy adjustments that had never troubled wealthier buyers. At Dunleavy Mercantile, the clerk measured his flour without meeting his eye. Earl answered each slight with arithmetic. He purchased what could not wait, then shifted reliance to stores he could control. 200 pounds of smoked venison hung from rafters in the cool chamber. 80 jars of beans sealed in waxed caps. 46 pounds of dried apples. 32 gallons of water cycled through clean barrels, and cordwood stacked to shoulder height along the north wall, enough by his consumption estimates for 12 weeks at strict rationing with 2 stoves running low and steady. He split and carried alone until the woodpile stood like a second wall. On October the 14th, a warmth arrived too perfect for the season. Noon at 62 degrees under a bright lid of sky with scarcely a cloud edge torn by wind, and that very smoothness troubled men who had lived through abrupt prairie turns. Earl noticed first the geese, not high and orderly as in ordinary migration, but low and dense after dark, crossing in tight lines that sounded hurried even from the yard. In 3 separate lots, horses turned their hindquarters toward the same quarter of horizon, though no gust yet touched their manes. Ant mounds sealed early, and cottonwood leaves dropped all at once on a day still warm enough for shirt sleeves. These were not omens in the language of superstition. They were field signs repeated in different regions and seasons, of pressure collapse and hard weather behind it. He set aside pride and rode house to house with plain instructions written on 6 folded sheets. Store water in every clean vessel before nightfall. Brace roof rafters where possible at end walls. Move fuel under cover. Tie a rope from door to nearest outbuilding so no one had to navigate blind in blowing rain. Keep one shovel indoors, not outside. His knocks were answered with courtesy in some homes, impatience in others. One ranch wife accepted the paper and thanked him quietly. Two men laughed and asked whether he planned to charge admission to his cellar. Pike opened his porch door only halfway, listened through 2 sentences, and said that fear talk damaged commerce worse than weather ever could. He told Earl to mind his own lot. 3 days passed before Earl heard from dispatch on the rail spur, and the message carried no comfort. Delayed freight from the east. No guarantee of delivery before month's end if tracks washed again near Platte Crossing. He took that delay as confirmation and began converting his root cellar from family reserve to shared refuge. Bench platforms rose along 3 walls in 2 tiers, each plank bedded on fieldstone piers to keep sleepers above damp. He set 2 cast-iron stoves at opposite corners with flues staggered, so draft from one would not choke the other. He built a barrel filter from sand, charcoal, and linen mesh, tested it with draw water clouded by silt, and marked the flow rate in quarts per hour. At the hatch, he widened the throat by 8 inches, then added an interior wind baffle of hanging canvas that could be dropped in one motion. The rope line came next, and it was the feature many had mocked before they understood it. Earl drove anchor posts at his own door, at the well shed, and at the stable. Each post sunk 4 feet and tamped with gravel, so saturated ground would not heave it free. Between them he stretched half-inch manila rope in double run, knotted at arm intervals, low enough for children to grasp and high enough to clear drift and mud wash. He tested it in darkness with a lantern hooded down, timing each traverse, adjusting slack where handholds failed. On October 28th, he extended a secondary line toward the lane edge that faced town, though no one had requested it and no ordinance required it. He left the gate unlatched every night thereafter. By month's end, the sleeping chart on the cellar wall marked places for 40 souls, with aisle widths measured to permit stretcher passage if needed, and Earl had set aside extra blankets, lamp oil, and a ledger page listing households with elders, infants, or limited mobility. The list was incomplete because many doors had closed to him in prior weeks, yet he wrote every name he could verify from church rolls and freight manifests. At dusk on October 31st, with the barometer falling and a thin ring around the moon, he walked the perimeter one final time, pressing a palm against each clay face as if reading temperature through skin. Behind him, Sage Hollow glowed in scattered window light, confident still in painted gables and high roofs. Before him, the draw lay dark and level, gathering what the sky had begun to send. During that same circuit, with the moon still ringed and the drawgrass lying flat without visible wind, he noticed that the north eave over the hatch carried a hairline shrink seam, no wider than a knife back, and he climbed the ladder again with a lantern shielded by tin, opened the line with a narrow chisel, and pressed in fresh mortar mixed at 6 parts screened clay to 2 parts sand with a lime cut suited for cold cure. He worked by touch as much as sight, because surface sheen under lantern light could lie about moisture, and he stopped only when the new band took the pressure of his thumb and resisted without gloss. The roof had already consumed 5 months of hauling, but that tradition did not permit reverence for completed labor. If weather offered 1 more hour, 1 more seam could be corrected. He spent the first hours of November 1st in maintenance that no passerby would ever notice and that no sales circular would ever praise. At dawn, with the air at 38 degrees and a hard quiet over Sage Hollow, he inspected each drainage channel from ridgeline to drip nose, using a straight edge cut from wagon slat and a marked peg for depth, clearing 3 shallow silt catches where dry grass had gathered. He laid an additional clay collar around both stove flues, feathered to shed driven rain, and checked the interior draw by burning twists of newspaper at different damper positions. watching smoke rise clean rather than fold back into the room. In the cellar, he resanded the filter barrel top layer after measuring a drop in flow from 5 quarts per hour to 3 1/2. Then boiled and dried 12 more jars to expand safe water storage from 32 gallons to 38. By noon, he had relashed 2 bench braces, moved the blanket bundles higher off the floor, and hung a second line of lantern hooks to keep aisle paths clear if the chamber filled in darkness. Costs mattered because stores measured survival as surely as walls did. His ledger for that day recorded 1 coil of Manila remnants at $1.10, 30 pounds of lamp oil at $4.20, 3 sacks of coal at retail surcharge, 2 boxes of stove bolts, and an exchange of labor with a hired day laborer for 30 trimmed willow rods to reinforce the laneside rope run. The man came only after dusk, hat low, speaking little, and worked fast in the lamplight as if the town itself might object to the sight. Together they drove 2 more posts at the draw edge where runoff first undercut the bank, then spliced a secondary handline with fisher knots every 4 feet, so gloved hands could find purchase without looking. Earl tested the line in full dark, shoulders leaned against a manufactured pull meant to mimic panic. It held. He drove the stakes deeper. By late afternoon, the project had ceased to resemble one house and had become a system spread across one modest parcel. Roof bed weighted and sealed. Walls thickened where splashback had once marked weakness. Cellar staged for triage. Fuel segregated by burn rate. Water filtered in rotation. Rope routes mapped for blind travel. Tools hung by sequence instead of habit. He prepared not for comfort but for load. Not for his own household, but for an uncertain crowd arriving wet, frightened and half frozen. On the interior wall beside the hatch, he chalked capacities and ration intervals where any sober hand could follow them. Stove 1, every 40 minutes feed half split. Stove 2, reserve until chamber temperature falls below 48. Water issue, 1 dipper each hour unless work detail assigned. Dry socks before blankets, keep aisle clear. The writing was plain and formal, less command than protocol, built for the hour when memory narrowed and common courtesy failed under fear. As dusk gathered, he rode into town for the last items he could not make: lamp wicks, coarse salt, and 2 replacement hinges for the stable door. Main Street held the strained brightness of a community choosing confidence as policy. Men stood outside Dunleavy Mercantile speaking of freight schedules that had not yet recovered. Women moved quickly between shop fronts with covered baskets, and Pike, broad in wet-finished broadcloth despite the mud, held a circle near the hitch rail as though presiding over a meeting no one had called. Earl tied off his mules and entered without ceremony. The clerk at the counter filled 2 of his requests, then said wicks would be sold by bundle only to account holders until the next shipment. Earl laid cash on the plank and asked the posted price. The clerk looked toward Pike through the open door before answering that policy was policy. Pike stepped in then, not loud at first, but with the practiced volume that turned private friction into public entertainment. He said a town could not keep trade stable if every man who expected a hard week bought as if the world were ending. He said rumor traveled faster than rails, and rumor emptied shelves faster than storms. Then he pointed through the front windows toward Cottonwood Draw and repeated the name he had given months earlier, this time with a tone meant to suggest civic responsibility rather than mockery. Jennings' grave was foolish in July, he said, and it remains foolish now. A settlement of respectable builders does not crawl underground because geese fly low. Several men near the flour barrels smiled without speaking. One repeated the phrase under his breath, as if testing whether it still pleased the room. Earl did not answer Pike. He counted coins into the clerk's hand for the salt and hinges, gathered the parcels he had been allowed to purchase, and turned for the door. On the threshold he met Clara Finch, carrying school ledgers under one arm and a sack of coal chips in the other, her coat already buttoned against a cold that had not yet dropped in full. She asked in a voice low enough to avoid spectacle whether his instructions on interior bracing could be adapted for the schoolhouse east wall, where a seam had opened after the June storm. Earl set his parcels down, took her ledger pencil, and drew a quick brace pattern on the back of an invoice. Diagonal pairs, sill to plate, opposite hand, nailed through blocks to prevent split. She thanked him once, direct and without apology, then crossed the street before Pike could intercept her. That brief exchange traveled through town faster than any sermon. By supper time, two boys had chalked Grave House on Earl's lane post. He washed it off with one bucket and a rag, and did not replace the words with any answer. The exclusion broadened after dark in ways that left no signatures. A coal wagon making rounds to pooled buyers passed his lane despite earlier payment. The driver claimed he had been given revised stops and would return in the morning, though no return came. At the blacksmith shed, where he had arranged to borrow a chain binder for stable reinforcement, the apprentice said the binder had been promised elsewhere and offered no alternate. Near the church frame, he heard his name spoken in the clipped cadence of committee talk and saw 3 council members glance toward him before stepping inside and closing the door. There was no proclamation, no ordinance, no clear accusation he could rebut. The mechanism was social pressure dispersed through ordinary transactions, efficient because each act looked small by itself. By lantern light at home, he entered each denial in the ledger beside each completed task, not as grievance but as data on what could no longer be relied upon once weather broke. He rose before dawn on November 2nd to a temperature of 34 degrees, a fine rain beginning from the southeast, and a barometer reading that had fallen another quarter-inch overnight. The rainfall was gentle at first, almost domestic in sound against the roof, and that mildness persuaded many in town that the prior week's warnings had been overwrought. Teamsters still moved feed between sheds. A pair of merchants argued over tariff marks at the rail office. Pike was seen near his newest houses, assuring buyers that steep pitch and good pine she'd ordinary weather without ceremony. Yet the non-human world gave a different account. Cattle in the south lot bunched tight against the lee fence before breakfast, though no dog pressed them. Sparrows vanished from street eaves. By mid-morning, the wind rotated north in a single hard swing, and the rain thickened into slant lines that stung bare skin. Earl closed his outer shutters, opened the cellar hatch, and lit both stoves to establish draft before crowds could foul the air. At 10 o'clock, he made one final round through the nearest lanes carrying coil rope, a hatchet, and 6 folded instruction sheets wrapped in oilcloth. He tied a hand line from Widow Price's porch to her woodshed, braced the rear door at the bell place where hinges had begun to pull, and urged the Rourke boys to bring their water barrels indoors before the freeze line rose. Most listened with strained politeness and returned to their own plans. 2 men told him the rain would pass by evening because Chinook patterns often teased hard and then vanished. One asked whether he intended to charge for bunks in his cellar, now that the town had heard he had marked sleeping places. Earl answered only that the hatch would remain unbarred. At the schoolhouse, Clara Finch had already set desks against the draft seam and tied blankets over the lower windows as he had sketched the evening before. She requested extra lamp oil for the children if the storm lengthened. He gave her 2 tins from his own reserve and marked the subtraction on his cuff with charcoal. By afternoon, the warning signs ceased to be signs and became conditions. Temperature fell from 33 to 26 degrees in less than 3 hours. Rain struck, paused, and returned as sleet that hardened on fence wire and stair treads. Gusts began arriving in long, muscular bursts that pushed men sideways in open ground and drove water through plank joints thought tight in fair weather. From the rise above Cottonwood Draw, Earl could see the first failures in sequence, shingles lifting at corners, porch roofs flexing where nails had been set too near grain edge, one fresh chimney leaning half a brick out of plumb as mortar joints took water and softened. He did not stand watching. He checked the rope runs again, adding cloth flags at intervals to guide hands in whiteout, then dragged 2 spare doors from the stable wall and set them by the hatch as improvised litters. Inside the cellar, he laid out dry kindling by size, prepared a kettle for broth, and hung a board by the entry listing occupancy counts in chalk columns, because confusion multiplied faster than wind once bodies began arriving. Shortly before dusk, with sleet now mixed with hard pellets of ice, and the first true howl in the wind, Harlan Pike rode down the lane in a covered buggy and stopped without dismounting, his horse lathered and eyes wide. He did not apologize. He did not taunt. He asked, in the flat tone of a man speaking against his own pride, how many souls Earl's chamber could take if Main Street houses began failing. Earl answered with the figure he had tested, not the figure he wished to avoid. 40 in the lower chamber with air rotation, he said. More in shifts above if stoves hold and fuel is managed. Pike gripped the buggy rail and stared at the roofline where clay and sod lay dark under freezing rain, then said that church families would likely come first because the frame stood central and visible. Earl told him to send them by the lane, not the draw crossing, and to keep hands on the rope once they reached his posts. Pike nodded once, turned the buggy, and drove back toward town through sleet that had already begun to erase wheel tracks within minutes. Night came early under the storm lid. By 6 o'clock, lamps in 3 houses had gone out along the western row, and by 7, voices carried over the wind from farther than they should have, scattered and sharp, the sound of a settlement realizing too late that ordinary plans had no purchase against what was arriving. Earl stood at his threshold in oilskin and gloves, one hand on the lane rope, listening not for argument now, but for footsteps, and behind him the cellar stoves settled into their first steady burn as Sage Hollow began moving, one household at a time, toward the house they had called a grave. The first family came through sleet so dense they looked like shadows dragged out of water. 3 figures on the rope line with their shoulders bent and one lantern swinging low enough to strike their knees. Earl took the lantern, counted them into the chalk column, and sent them down the hatch with instructions he had already written. Boots by the ladder, blankets only after socks were dry. Keep the center aisle open. 2 more households followed within 10 minutes. Then 4 men from the church frame carrying an elder between them on one of the spare doors Earl had set aside. By 7:30, the outer room was full of wet coats, steaming near the stove, and the cellar held 21 souls. And still the lane rope shuddered under new hands arriving out of the black. At 8, the temperature dropped to 21 degrees. Rain turned to hard sleet that came sideways, each pellet driven by a north wind, measured later at 72 miles per hour by the rail office anemometer before its vein tore free. The weather was no longer weather in the ordinary sense. It was force organized against joints, nails, hinges, and patience. Board walls took water through seams, then froze, then swelled apart. Roof pitches that had looked proud in dry months caught uplift at the corners and began to peel in long, ragged sections. Along Main Street, porch columns failed where shallow posts had softened in June and never been reset. By 8:45, one of Pike's newest houses on Cotton Street lost its entire west roof plane and exposed 2 upstairs rooms to sleet and wind in a single minute. Earl moved in circuits he had rehearsed in dry weather: threshold, rope line, stable corner, hatch, stove draft, occupancy board, then out again. He tied children and elders to the manila run in pairs, wrist to rope, rope to belt, so no sudden gust could separate them in the dark. He sent able men in teams of 2 with lanterns hooded down and ordered them to stay within line distance of a fixed post. One returned with a woman whose hands had gone stiff around a bucket handle. She still would not release. Another came back with 2 boys and no hat, his hair iced white at the temples, though he was scarcely 30. The cellar count reached 36 by 9:15. He opened the upper room pallets and shifted blankets to the floor above to preserve breathing space below. By 9:30, the church steeple sheared at the base and vanished into the storm. Its bell struck once as it fell, and then went silent. That sound traveled farther than prayer had traveled in fair weather, and in that hour it acted as a signal no one had intended. The central shelter had failed. Families who had waited there broke into the street and turned toward Cottonwood Draw because they had heard, from one mouth to the next, that Jennings had rope and heat and walls that did not rattle apart. Pike arrived on foot with 6 others, broadcloth coat dark with water and mud to the thigh, his hat gone, his watch chain hanging loose from a torn button seam. He had spent years selling height and ornament, and now he stood under a low eave of clay and sod, asking where to place bodies so they could live to morning. Earl put him to work without speech-making. Carry wood to the north stack. Feed stove 1/2 split each 40 minutes. Count arrivals allowed at the hatch, so the ledger stayed true. Pike obeyed in the stripped, economical manner of a man who had no spare breath for pride. At 10 o'clock, his second speculative house collapsed inward when a front wall lost its sill and folded. Witnesses later said the decorative cornice lay in the street like kindling by lamplight. At 10:20, his third and newest house failed at the porch line and took the entry stair with it. The man who had mocked weight now watched light construction break under wet load and crosswind exactly where Earl had warned it would. The storm deepened through the late hours of November 2nd and into the first minutes of November 3rd, with a rhythm that punished every pause in attention. Sleet became granular ice, then thick wet snow that packed against doors and choked fence gaps, then sleet again when a brief warm pulse rose above the draw and collapsed. Earl kept both stoves burning low and steady rather than high and wasteful. He posted ration intervals in chalk and checked each kettle himself before issuing broth, because panic could empty stores in one hungry hour. In the upper room, exhausted men slept sitting against walls while women rotated at the hatch to receive new arrivals. In the cellar, air stayed above 50 degrees. The filter barrel flowed at 4 quarts per hour, and each small success depended on every earlier hour of unseen labor. Outside, plans failed in sequence. The Price porch roof lifted first and slammed back against the wall until hinge nails tore free. The Dunleavy rear storeroom flooded when water came under the sill and turned flour sacks to paste. At the rail office, ledger books were carried to a loft and still took water through warped clapboards. Teams broke loose from 2 hitch rails and vanished downslope when a gate chain snapped. Men who had laughed in October now crawled on knees along rope lines, unable to keep footing against gusts that shoved like a living shoulder. The settlement's social order, measured for years by frontage, contract size, and polished boots, thinned to one question repeated at every door. Does this structure hold? Near midnight, Clara Finch was seen at the schoolhouse with 2 pupils whose families had been separated in the run from church to lane. She had stayed behind to check each corner after the first evacuation, then found the children crouched beneath a broken desk in the east room where a brace had cracked loose. She wrapped them in her coat, tied one to each wrist with curtain cord, and brought them down the steps into drift and sleet. 2 men reached them within sight of the rope post. The children survived the crossing and were brought into Earl's upper room breathing hard, but conscious, still clutching the fabric she had used to bind them close. Clara Finch did not survive the same crossing. Cold had taken too much while she held them upright through the worst gust line, and by first light she could not be warmed. She was 24 years old, and the school slates in her satchel were still dry. After 1 in the morning, Amos Bell made a final run to his porch where his mule, Old Finn, had tangled the lead around the post and was striking the rail in blind terror. Bell cut the lead with a hay knife and got the animal free, but the beam above, already loosened by repeated impacts and soaked at the joint, dropped when the next gust hit broadside. Neighbors pulled at the timber with a fence chain and crowbar until their hands failed in the cold. They reached him before dawn, but he had been pinned too long in freezing sleet. Old Finn was later found at the lane fence, alive and trembling, with the cut lead still hanging from his halter. Bell had hauled freight into Sage Hollow through 6 winters and had never missed a delivery day until that night. Toward 2 in the morning, Widow Price's youngest, Nathan Price, was not in the count at the cellar board. He had been sent earlier with older cousins toward an uncle's shed before the draw crossing flooded, and in the confusion of moving groups, no one marked where he turned back. Earl marked the omission beside the family name and sent word along each incoming rope team to check sheds, porches, and wagon shadows on their return passes. No clear report came back before dawn, and his line on the board remained open, a blank space in the middle of crowded chalk. By first light on November the 3rd, the storm had not ended, but its first fury had broken into heavy gust cycles and hard intermittent sleet. Earl climbed to the hatch rim and looked across Sage Hollow through a moving gray veil. Roof sections lay in yards where kitchens had stood. The church frame remained upright but open to the sky where steeple and shingles had been. Pike's 3 showcase houses were either collapsed or stripped to unlivable shells. Smoke rose from almost nowhere except Earl's flues and one far chimney near the rail cut. When he checked his board, 67 souls had passed through his doors since nightfall, with 42 still in the cellar and upper room. The rest rotated to safer corners once immediate collapse risk passed. In later recovery, tallies compiled after the storm, Nathan Price was listed among those who did not survive. In that morning interval, when fatigue made voices blunt and old quarrels briefly useless, Pike came down the hatch ladder carrying 2 split logs and set them by stove 2 before speaking. His hands shook from cold and overwork, and the broadcloth that had marked status the day before now hung heavy and torn, no different from any other wet coat in the room. "There are more stranded east of the schoolyard," he said, keeping his voice low so the children would not hear alarm. "The lane line does not reach that cut. I need your rope team and your door sled." It was the first direct request he had made of Earl since spring that did not carry instruction or ridicule. Earl nodded once, already reaching for the coil he had dried by the stove. He assigned Pike the forward anchor position because Pike knew the yard posts and could find them under drift. He gave the rear drag on the door sled to one of Pike's soaked yard hands who had come in during the night with his family. He put 2 teenagers on lantern duty and tied each to the main line with chestnuts so no gust could separate them. No conditions were named. No apologies were demanded at the hatch. The work stood first. They moved out at 7:20 under sleet that stung like sand and wind, still strong enough to erase tracks in minutes. At the schoolyard cut, they found 5 souls sheltering behind a toppled wagon bed and 1 elder unable to stand after hours in wet wool. The team lashed the wagon bed to the door sled, loaded 2 at a time, and ran the return route in 3 passes, each pass slower as drifts rose and legs failed. Pike took 1 fall to the shoulder, rose without complaint, and kept the line tight for those behind him. When they reached Earl's threshold on the final pass, the cellar count rose again, and the stoves answered with that low, steady tone of controlled heat under load. The storm would continue into another day and night before the wind finally eased. But by mid-morning on November the 3rd, the pattern had changed in one essential way. Sage Hollow no longer scattered its efforts in isolated houses. It moved by rope, by count, by ration, and by instruction, written in chalk by the man it had mocked for building low and heavy beside the draw. Earl checked the ledger, marked the rescued names, and handed Pike the next coil to dry and reset. As if this division of labor had always been the most ordinary fact in town. With that coil exchanged, the work settled into a discipline that did not permit heroics, only repetition. Earl measured flour by cup, venison by ounce, lamp oil by marked tin, and gave the same instruction to each new pair of hands. Eat warm, dry your feet, take a task, report the count. Pike hauled wood until his palms split through softened skin. The Dunleavy clerk, who had once withheld wick bundles under policy, sat by the filter barrel and strained silt water through linen for hours without lifting his eyes. Two ranch women who had never crossed words with Earl portioned beans into 67 equal servings while sleet hammered the hatch cover. By noon on November the 3rd, the cellar held 44 souls in rotation. The upper room held 11 more, and the rope teams had brought 12 in and out since dawn. Earl used Ruth's old notebook margins for triage marks, assigning stove duty to the strongest, child watch to steady elders, and line work to those who could still feel their fingers in wet gloves. That afternoon taught the town the price of old vanity in numbers no auctioneer could soften. Pike's 3 speculative houses had cost buyers between $1,150 and $1,420 each in lumber, trim, and finish, and all 3 stood gutted or folded, their decorative fronts lying in mud like stage flats. Dunleavy's rear stock, insured only in part, lost 22 flour sacks, 9 sugar barrels, and 2 crates of lamp chimneys to flood and freeze in a single night. The schoolhouse roof, repaired cheaply after June, split again at the east seam and surrendered 2 rooms to drift. Earl's low house, built on $18 ground with clay, hauled by mule and labor counted in his own torn hands, held load after load of wet bodies, and did not surrender its roofline by an inch. He did not speak that comparison aloud. The wall spoke it for him. Near dusk, with wind still driving from the north, a runner came off the lane extension and reported that Nathan Price had been located near the flooded channel, crossing beyond the unfinished secondary line, and had not survived exposure in cold water. Earl wrote the entry at once in the casualty ledger, set the time, and had Deacon and Counsel initials placed beside it for record. Word was carried quietly to Widow Price in the upper room, where she sat for an hour with Clara Finch's coal sack folded in her lap, because Clara had handed it to Nathan earlier that week when his fingers had gone red in morning cold. The town had now lost 3 named souls in 2 days, each death tied to an act of care, and no one in Sage Hollow used the word inconvenience again. 3 days passed before the wind broke cleanly. On November 5th, shortly after sunrise, the temperature stood at 9 degrees under a pale sky, and the storm at last released the roofs it had tested. Earl sent teams house to house with chalk and cord, marking each structure as livable, repairable, or abandoned. Of 79 dwellings counted before the storm, 11 remained fit for immediate habitation. 23 could be made habitable with urgent bracing and dry fuel, and 45 were uninhabitable shells or collapse fields. His own house and cellar had sheltered 67 souls at peak turnover, then served as kitchen and warming station as families resorted by need. He opened the venison stores to communal pot, issued bean jars by household size, and required only 1 exchange in return. Each recipient would attend evening instruction on roof sealing, drainage cuts, and rope layout before any rebuild began. Instruction began that same night in the damaged church frame, where sleet still rimed the rafters and breath showed white in lantern light. Earl set a plank on 2 crates and used charcoal to draw a roof section in profile. He showed why weight at the cap resisted uplift better than light shingles nailed into wet pine, why a 1-inch drop per 6 feet spared a seam in freeze, why drip noses had to throw water clear of wall faces, and why every family needed an interior shovel and a door line to fixed ground. Pike stood at the edge of that circle with his coat patched at both elbows and repeated each measurement aloud so the back rows could hear. The same men who had laughed in August copied ratios on scrap paper torn from freight bills. No sermon was offered. Technique replaced argument. By the second week of November, the reckoning moved from labor to speech because silence had become heavier than timber. The town gathered in the roofless church frame on the evening of November the 14th. 241 souls present by deacon count, with snow crusting the aisles where pews had once stood dry. Pike stepped first onto the plank platform, no watch chain visible, no broadcloth shine left in his coat, and gave the confession the town had already watched him earn in splintered hands. He quoted his own words exactly, said he had called Earl's home Jennings' grave to defend a business model that failed under real weather, and admitted that pride in appearance had blinded him to function. He named the 3 dead, then stated that his designs had not killed them alone, yet had shaped a settlement too vulnerable to protect them. He surrendered his independent contracts for the winter season, asked the council to adopt Earl's construction standards as public requirement, and requested assignment as foreman under Earl's method until spring thaw. After him came smaller voices, each plain, each costly. Dunleavy admitted that he had priced fear and status higher than preparedness, denied credit where it was needed, and then survived on rations from the same man he had constrained at the counter. Councilman Reed acknowledged the failed ordinance attempt and asked that the council minutes record his support for that motion by name, so future readers would know he had tried to ban the very design that saved his grandchildren. Linus Dahl, who had left Earl's crew under pressure, said he had feared wage loss more than weather and had taught his sons the same fear, then watched those sons cross Earl's rope line weeping in the night. No one asked for easy pardon. Each speaker named what they had done, what it had cost, and what they would now do differently under public record. When Earl rose, the room did not quiet at once because children shifted and someone dropped a coal scuttle near the rear. He waited, gloved hands resting on the plank edge, then spoke in the same measured tone he had used at the hatch when assigning stove intervals. Ruth Jennings and her mother taught me that a roof is judged on the worst day, never the fair one. I did not build by cottonwood draw to prove any man foolish. I built because weather does not negotiate, and because burial comes fast when a town mistakes decoration for shelter. You ask about forgiveness. I cannot trade that word tonight like a coin across a counter. Clara Finch is dead. Amos Bell is dead. Nathan Price is dead. Their names deserve more than a sentence that eases us. I will teach every hand that comes ready to work and ready to listen. Whether that becomes forgiveness is work for years, not one meeting. No applause followed. Men and women rose in order of household and signed a rebuilding register on the church crate, pledging labor days, wagon teams, clay hauling, and shared stores. Earl entered every pledge into his ledger and required each signer to attend practical sessions at first light. Through that winter and the next 2 building seasons, Sage Hollow rebuilt 54 homes to lower profiles, thicker walls, clay-sealed caps, and trench lines that carried runoff away from thresholds. Roof crews worked in measured lifts with cure intervals recorded on wall slates. Every new house above 12 feet to eave required a weighted cap variance approved by council and inspected by Pike. who now wore work denim and carried Earl's straight edge in his back pocket. The phrase "building like Jennings" entered job talk first as instruction, then as praise. Rail dispatch resumed regular freight by late December, and with it came letters from neighboring settlements asking why Sage Hollow had lower casualty numbers than towns of similar size along the same storm track. Earl refused paid consultation and sent copies of his ratios and rope diagrams through the church post at cost of paper and postage only. His physical evidence remained exact. The November occupancy board preserved in dry storage, the casualty ledger signed by deacon and council, and Ruth's trunk of method notes deposited by agreement in a locked church chest each spring for apprentices to study. Nothing stayed anecdote if it could be measured, dated, and taught. Years later, the social hierarchy that had once revolved around trim catalogs and credit tables had shifted toward crews, stores, and winter drills. By 1903, Sage Hollow counted 389 souls on the parish roll. Children practiced rope traverses each October before first frost. The schoolhouse east wall carried Clara Finch braces in doubled diagonal pairs, and a small plaque naming her for the two pupils she sheltered, Amos Bell's mule. Old Finn worked light cart duty until age took him, then was buried above the draw with the cut lead rope coiled at the marker post. Nathan Price's mother funded 3 additional rope runs across flood cuts, each tagged with tin whistles for night location, and no child crossing those lines afterward lacked a handhold. The old nickname did not disappear. It changed meaning. Men on distant crews asked for Jennings roof caps on bids. Travelers who had heard the story wrong came expecting a dugout for one stubborn widower and found a plain weather-stained house that had become communal refuge by custom, stocked each storm season by rotating households. Pike lived long enough to see apprentices correct his old plans in public without fear. He accepted each correction, signed each revised sheet, and ended his days known less as master builder than as the foreman who learned in time. The house above Cottonwood Draw still stands. Its roof remains low, heavy, and quiet under hard weather. When geese fly dense and low in October dark, doors in Sage Hollow open early. Rope lines are checked before supper, and neighbors arrive before panic with blankets, ledgers, and tasks already assigned. On October the 16th, 1903, with the evening temperature falling from 41 to 34 degrees in less than an hour, and a pale ring gathering around the moon above Cottonwood Draw, the first wagon arrived at Earl Jennings's lane before dark, then the second, then 3 on foot with blanket rolls and lard tins balanced in their arms, all of them early by design, all of them moving with the practiced quiet of souls who had learned that preparation was not panic, but duty. Pike stood at the rope post with a lantern hooded low, calling names and tallying arrivals against the drill ledger, his voice roughened by age yet steady in cadence. Inside, the old clay roof gave back its familiar low tone under fresh gusts, and younger men who had never heard the storm of 1886 listened for it with the same attention they once reserved for sermons. Earl did not preside from a chair. He worked the tables, weighing smoked venison in 8-ounce cuts, assigning bean jars by household number, and making boys read each chalk instruction aloud before they touched stove iron. The communal stores had been rotated that week under council rule: 260 pounds of cured meat, 104 jars of beans and beets, 60 pounds of cornmeal, lamp oil enough for 9 nights at ration burn, and 3 spare coils of manila rope purchased at $1.18 each after freight rates shifted that spring. Every item was entered before use, and every item was accounted for after use, because Earl had long held that a ledger was as much a shelter as a wall when hunger and fear tried to turn neighbors against one another. Beside the hatch, the original occupancy board from November 1886 hung in a fitted pine frame under glass, chalk marks preserved where 67 names had once been counted in sleet dark hours. Children traced those marks with mittened fingers and then withdrew their hands when told whose names did not return. By full dark, wind struck in long, forceful runs across the draw, and sleet began at the north corners exactly where Earl had warned the apprentices to watch. One of those apprentices, Jonah Reed, grandson of the councilman who had once voted for the ban, reported a shallow ice dam forming near the east drip line. Earl sent him to fetch the straight edge and made him correct it himself while Pike held the lantern and asked him to call each measurement as he worked. 1 inch drop in 6 feet, Jonah said into the wind, voice shaking once and then strengthening. Clear run now. Earl nodded, then had him repeat the reason for the slope before climbing down, not because tradition demanded recitation, but because memory failed first when cold entered the joints. At midnight, the gust front passed south, and the worst of that storm spent itself on open prairie before it could build into catastrophe. Still, no one in Sage Hollow called the long evening unnecessary. They cleaned the kettles, re-waxed jar seals, and returned rations by weight to the communal shelves. In the last hour before dawn, Pike carried the framed casualty ledger from the church chest to Earl's table and set it beside Ruth's trunk without speaking. The ledger bore deacon and council initials from 1886, plus every annual verification since, and its pages remained dry because 3 generations had guarded it as they guarded seed grain. Pike rested one hand on the cover, then turned to the 20 or so souls still awake and spoke so all could hear. I looked at that moon ring in 1886 and told 2 men it meant little, he said. I looked at geese flying low and said commerce mattered more than caution. I looked at this man's roof and called it a grave. There is no dignity in pretending I did not know better signs when they stood before me. There is only work in naming failure each year, so we do not repeat it with prettier language. He then faced Jonah Reed and the other young builders and ordered them to read the first 3 casualty entries aloud, not as punishment, but as oath. Clara Finch, Amos Bell, Nathan Price. Each name landed in the room with the weight of timber. 3 days later, with skies clear and daytime temperatures near 50, the town held its October accounting in the rebuilt church, now roofed low and braced in double diagonals that still carried Finch's pattern. The attendance count reached 327 souls. This time there was no platform spectacle, only benches set in a square and every ledger open on plain plank tables. Supply stocks, rope maintenance intervals, fuel reserves, winter infirmary lists, and an archive box labeled correspondence and reports. Dunleavy, long since retired from daily trade, rose first and read letters from 4 neighboring settlements that had requested Sage Hollow methods in prior years. Each letter now carried a return note of outcomes. One town had adopted interior rope lines after a March blizzard and reported 0 losses in school evacuation. Another had copied the filter barrel design and reduced winter sickness in crowded shelter rooms. External contacts had not vanished into pride. They had been answered, tested, and brought back as record. When the correspondence ended, Councilman Reed, older now and walking with a cane, asked to address one matter that had remained half-spoken since the storm years. He confirmed before witnesses that the closed-door meeting on November the 1st, 1886, the one men had seen through the church window and never fully explained, had not been prayer or budget at all, but a last attempt by 3 council members to draft emergency authority against subsurface dwellings, even as sleet already struck the walls. We were prepared to condemn the one structure that could hold us, he said. The paper was written. It was not signed only because the ink froze in the inkwell when the stove failed. He placed that unsigned sheet, preserved and brittle, on the table beside the casualty ledger so no descendant could claim the danger had been exaggerated after the fact. All eyes turned then to Earl. He remained seated for a long moment, one palm on Ruth's trunk lid, thumb resting over the old repaired lock. When he stood, he did not take the center, and he did not raise his voice. "You have done what I asked many years ago," he said. "You have named what happened in full daylight and entered it into record. Do not mistake this for a ceremony complete in itself. A settlement can confess and still forget in 5 mild winters. Keep the methods public. Keep stores shared. Keep children on the ropes before first frost. If you wish to honor Ruth Jennings, Eliza May Carter, and the line before them, do not carve praise. Teach ratios correctly. Check drainfall with a straight edge, not a guess. Correct your foreman when he is wrong, even if his coat is finer than yours." A woman from the back bench then asked the question that had waited in one form or another for 17 years. "Earl, do you forgive us?" He didn't dismiss her, and he did not offer the town a quick benediction. "I live among you," he said. "I have eaten from your tables and watched you haul clay in January wind without complaint. I have also buried friends whose names we read tonight. I cannot trade one word for all of that. I can give you this instead. No child in Sage Hollow will be denied this knowledge while I draw breath. That is what I have to give." It was not absolution. It was greater and harder. In January 1908, when Earl's hands had stiffened enough that Pike now carried most of the roof loads, the council voted unanimously to place Ruth's trunk, the original occupancy board, the casualty ledger, the unsigned ordnance sheet, and the first rope diagram in a cedar cabinet at the church under 2-key custody. 1 key held by the foreman, 1 by the schoolteacher. They paid $23 for glass fronts and iron hasps, and another $6 for copied instruction sheets distributed to every household before winter set. Each document was cataloged by date, material, and witness initials. Nothing that had saved the town was left to rumor. On March 9, 1911, with late snow running wet along the trench lines and the noon bell sounding clear in cold air, Earl Jennings died in his chair beside the north stove, 62 years old by church record. Boots dry, ledger open to fuel tallies for the week. He was buried above Cottonwood Draw within sight of the low roof he had sealed by hand in 1886. And Pike, bent but unshaken, read the burial lines himself. No monument of marble was ordered. The apprentices set a fieldstone and carved one sentence approved by unanimous household vote: "Build for the worst day and leave the door unbarred." The house still stands above the draw, plain, weather-stained, and sound. Each October, when geese fly low and horses turn their hindquarters toward a wind not yet felt in town, Sage Hollow opens early, checks the ropes before supper, reads the names before lighting the stoves, and fills the old rooms in orderly calm, not because fear commands them, but because memory, measurement, and generosity do.